We've tried to show that Genesis 1 and 2 begins with synoptic, resumptive, expansive storytelling, and it continues that way later in chapter 1, where it says God created man, male and female, in his own image. This arguably is a synoptic account of the creation of mankind, whereas Genesis 2 would be resumptive and expansive, giving more details from a different point of view. Thus, Genesis 1 and 2 are not two creation accounts, but one story told using synoptic, resumptive, expansive repetition. Again, you tell the story once, then you pick up some details and you tell it again. This also happens in Genesis 15. Source critics see two sources, but arguably it's one story told twice to portray the same event from different points of view. Here's the account, and I'll pause, and actually you should pause the video and read these verses, and then we'll discuss them. Now, in Genesis 15, you have, according to the Wellhausen critics, two different accounts that contradict each other. In verse 6, Abraham believes God and it's reckoned to him for righteousness. But when you get to verse 8, he's back in unbelief. What happened? In verse 5, it's already dark. You can see the stars. But in verse 12, the sun is not yet gone down. And so from these contradictions, they posit that there are two different sources. Wellhausen identified verses 1 through 6 as E, and he identified verses 7 through 21 as J. But you don't really need to do that. If you look at the outline of the passage here, this is after Gordon Wenham. He shows that the two parts of the chapter, verses 1 through 6 and verses 7 through 21, parallel each other. You have the beginning of each set of verses with Yahweh's word, promise of reward in verse 1, promise of reward in verse 7, then Abram's word, where he complains about lack of seed in verses 2 and 3. He wants some sort of guarantee in verse 8. Then Yahweh's reaction gives a promise about an heir in verse 4, gives an oath or commands an oath rite to be performed in verse 9. And then there's a public act. Abram goes outside to look at the stars in verse 5. He begins the oath rite, carrying out the oath rite in verses 16 and 17. Then Yahweh gives a word. He promises the seed in verse 5. He promises the land in verse 13 through 16. And then each has a conclusion. In the conclusion, Abraham believes God, has faith. And the conclusion of 7 through 21 is God makes a covenant with Abram. One can argue that this is a case of resumptive repetition, where the two accounts are describing exactly the same event. Though in the first telling of the story, it's from the angle of the seed promise, and from the second telling of the story, it's from the angle of the covenant and land promise. And if you posit that that's what's going on, then everything resolves in terms of contradictions. So when verse 7 begins, it's flashing back to before when Abraham believed God and back to when he was still showing unbelief. It flashes back to before the sun had set and the stars had come out. In other words, verses 1 through 6 gives the bottom line that Abraham believes God. Verses 7 through 21 gives more details on how he came to believe God, and that this involved God's making a covenant with him. Thus, this third pillar from contradictions and divergent viewpoints also proves to be unsound. Well, what about the fourth pillar? Well, the fourth pillar has to do with doublets. Are there two creation accounts, a doublet? No, we've already argued that it's really two accounts of the same story using synoptic resumptive expansive storytelling. In Genesis 1, you're given a more general account, a little bit semi-poetic account. In Genesis 2, you resume and expand that account to focus in on man and how Eve was, how man became male and female with the creation of Eve. There's no need to posit different sources or authors. Well, what about the wife-sister motif in various parts of Genesis, where twice Sarah and once Rebecca were passed off as the sister of their husband and almost were lost to foreign kings? Well, it's certainly a very unusual thing that's described here, but it's not impossible for such things to happen even 3 times over 2 centuries. History is full of improbable things happening. The stories actually reflect the purposes of a single author who's trying to draw attention to similarities in these incidents in order to further a literary purpose. Wybrey puts it this way. He says the repetition of what is basically the same story is integral to the literary effect intended by the author. He was deliberately drawing attention to the theme of God's preserving his promised Abram by informing his readers that God intervened not once, but 3 times to ensure the fulfillment of the promise of progeny. Thus, the fourth pillar from doublets is also not conclusive. Well, what about the last pillar from composite sections? First of all, a general remark. Source critics destroy the aesthetic beauty of biblical narratives by assigning sections or even single verses or even parts of verses to diverse sources. They destroy the symmetry, the beauty, the logic of the narratives. With the flood account, they miss the coherent chiasm that suggests that this is not a scissors and paste editing, but is the work of a single author. But we will have to wait to the next video to explain that further.